Hi, I'm Dr. Phil with the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, and I am so excited to talk to Edgar Villanueva about his new book. In case you don't know, the Campaign for Black Male Achievement is a national organization, it is a membership organization, and it is dedicated to improving the life outcomes of leaders in the field of Black male achievement. And so we recently got this phenomenal book, Decolonizing Wealth, and I am so excited about it. I feel like you have written the book that, represents ideas and thoughts and concepts that's been going on in our minds for such a long time. And so thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us and have a chat about the book.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
It's a real honor to have you here. So tell me, why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote this book for a couple reasons. One, it was an act of obedience to myself, to the movement, to my brothers and sisters that work in the nonprofit sector and in philanthropy. Because, like you said, there is a story that we have. There's an experience that is shared across a lot of folks who are well-meaning and are really wanting to see transformative change in our communities. And we need, but there's been something that's been holding us back. We haven't been able in philanthropy, especially, to get to an authentic conversation or a real conversation around issues of white supremacy that really show up in our work in various ways. And so I feel a sense of urgency. We need change. We need it now. Our political moment cannot withstand us procrastinating or taking longer to figure this out. So this is my contribution to a bigger conversation in conjunction with a lot of others who have been planting the seeds and pushing for this type of real conversation for a long time.
I love it. I love it. And, I work with the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, and I lead an endeavor that is called BMA Health and Healing Strategies. And so, of course, when I saw the other part of the title of the book, a lot of people say decolonizing wealth, but there's another piece to it, and it's indigenous wisdom to heal divides and restore balance. Why was it important for you to add this part to the title?
Well, one, the indigenous part, because I am Native American, and part of my own struggle and my identity as a person, but my identity as someone who works in the field of philanthropy, has been one that's been confusing and a struggle. And where I've recently had the opportunity to reconnect with my community, with elders in my community, and remember the indigenous wisdom and the nativeness that is in my body, that has really centered me and helped me remember why I do this work. And that wisdom that is so resilient, that has gotten us this far, and the fact that we're still here after 500 years of colonization and trauma in our communities, there's something very special about indigenous wisdom and perspective that I think the entire sector can benefit from knowing and sharing with us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is something that I felt very strongly about for a very long time, that we need to share stories. And this idea of colonization is it's scary. It's scary for white people in particular. And there's so many questions I want to ask you, but I received a question that I have to ask first, because I think it's a question that's on everyone's mind. And that is a moral or ethical argument enough to cause massive people to give up privilege and advantage?
I am in the camp that I believe a moral revival is necessary. There are historical reasons, and there's a business case for this work. But ultimately, if you're not intrinsically connected to the humanity that we all share and see that as a real connection, then you're going to be limited in your scope or your vision for how things can be different. My Native heritage teaches me that we are all related, and that literally I'm related to the animals and to the trees and to everyone in this room and to everyone that's watching. And if you live and behave in a way that is your reality, it's going to have you to respond and live your life and make different kinds of choices to reflect those values. I have been asked to talk with investors, for example, who have the sole purpose and mission of making more money. And I've been invited in for some conversations, and those are really difficult conversations to even begin if they don't have a value around, yes, make more money, but do that while you are helping, or at least not causing harm to communities. And so when you don't have a value about it, it's really, I think, a difficult starting place.
Yeah, and then there's also this underlying fear.
Yeah.
Right. There's an underlying fear that I'm giving something up. It's connected to, maybe I call it zero-sum game, right? I can't win unless you lose. But there's another way of being. And you're talking about that other way of being in this book, which I think is great. So for those of you who have not read the book yet, you have a central proposition that a colonizer virus is planted in people via the culture at first contact some 500 years ago, right? And it lives in institutions of this country, schools, agriculture, finance, among others. So we know that it continues to survive and operate, and we know that there's a fear around that. Can you talk about what steps we can take to start reversing that trend?
Absolutely. So I do talk about colonization as a virus that is built into our DNA as a country, as a community. It's in the air that we breathe, the dynamics of fear, separation, control, oppression, scarcity. These are all mindsets that inhabit the way that we live our lives and the work that we do. So in order to begin to unpack that and to decolonize our thinking, it's hard to diagnosing any type of disease. If this is a virus, step one is actually knowing that you have it, right? And so part of our challenge in this country, and definitely in the philanthropic sector where there's a lot of wealth and privilege, is that we are completely unaware that these dynamics are showing up in our work. We're not aware that we are actually perpetuating in many cases the divide between the haves and the have-nots, and perpetuating mindsets of scarcity and division. And so we have to, one, understand our history, have to look back and really understand what is the history of colonization, how have people in the land been exploited, what are those dynamics, and how might they be showing up in the work that I do? Because most of us in this sector that are working with young people, nonprofits, philanthropy, are well-meaning people. No one's getting up in the morning thinking, oh, I can't wait to get to work today to perpetuate white supremacy, right? But these dynamics are baked into our organizations, into our systems and our processes. And so we have to first be aware and begin to diagnose and figure out where can we begin to unpack and disrupt and dismantle and change the way that we do business so that we are helping to contribute to closing this gap that exists in our communities.
Yes, absolutely. And so that leads me to this amazing quote that you have, because I see everything as medicine, right? Potentially anyway. And this quote is so beautiful. Yet before we can move forward with using money as medicine, right? To heal divides and restore balance, we have to grieve. Grieving requires softening of your self-protective defense mechanisms enough to feel, getting beyond the denial, numbness, which is really powerful for you to state, righteousness, apathy, and other obstacles we have put in place to avoid the depths of pain. The humanity that was previously made invisible must be made visible again. So there's an aspect to healing that is scary for people, because in order for me to heal, I have to first expose the pain. Right. So can you talk a little bit about your inspiration for this quote and how we move through that process?
Absolutely. So I have found that there are many folks who want to avoid this conversation. Just like some people don't like to go to the doctor, you'd rather live in being sort of naive or ignorant to a lot of conversations and realities that are painful. And so for me, the idea or the concept of grieving came about because I began as a person who is Native American from the South, working in institutional philanthropy for a number of years, assimilated to dominant culture in a lot of ways, some willingly, some I didn't know that I was giving up a part of myself, of my soul, to do this work. But when I reached a point of emptiness and frustration because I was not bringing my values and my beliefs and culture into the workplace in a way that was allowing me to thrive, I felt really sad about that. I felt sad that I felt like I had to give those things up in order to be successful in this sector. And so that's my personal grieving. I think there's a broader context of grieving for organizations, for philanthropy, for example. We have to grieve the wisdom and the knowledge or the awareness of where this money came from. We have to come to terms with that truth and feel bad about it. This money, in many cases, has been intergenerational wealth that's been passed down from the descendants of slave owners and those who stole land and committed genocide and exploited low-wage workers, mostly workers of color. And so the reality that we, even though we are good people and we set out to do good work, we are inherently connected to a history that has traumatized our communities and has harmed our communities. And so if we can begin by acknowledging that, grieving that, and feeling bad about that, I think we'll be motivated and open to a place where we can think about a different future or path forward together.
That's a tall ask. It's a tall ask because we live in a society where we just want to take a pill to make pain go away. Right? We want things to happen really fast. Right? So for people out there thinking, well, is there some quick way something quick that I can do? What would you say to folks to help them shift their mindset away from this quick fix, I got to do it right now, that this is kind of a long-term strategy that we have to shift the trajectory of the mentality and bring humanity to our country?
Absolutely. There's no quick fix. This is, the mindset of colonization, the mindset, all of the dynamics of colonization, which again are lifting up whiteness as being best, a white dominant culture, ideas of scarcity and fear, control, domination. All of those are a part of the norm for us, right? When you look at who controls the books we read in college, when you look at who controls the airways in the media, when you look at who controls finance, banking, the movement of capital through our system, by far it's white folks and white men who are controlling those messages. So all of us have in some way kind of accepted that as the norm. And so to begin to think differently, to decolonize our thinking to a different shift where we value different things and we think of impact and investment, return on investment as different things, it requires a complete, almost a rebirth, right? I think about it like walking backwards on the moving elevator. If you're at JFK with a moving sidewalk, right? And everyone's rushing and going a certain way. It's literally like turning around and walking in the opposite direction. And bumping into everyone and going in a different way. And it's hard work, and it's work that's going to last a lifetime. For all of us, even those of us who are enlightened and have done our work, we all have our biases because we're drinking that in every single day. So we have to be accountable. We have to check ourselves. I say that we have to get booster shots, even if we feel like we've healed from the virus or we're immune from the virus. It mutates and comes back in different forms. White supremacy gets smarter. It finds other ways to creep into our systems and policies, even in the most well-meaning institutions. Yes. And so being aware and being in front of that and just being willing to work hard to change it. Yes. We are not going to get there by doing the easy thing, but it is the right thing, and we have to be committed to just doing that work for the rest of our lives.
So I want to tease out something you said to make sure everyone heard that. It sounded like you said, in order for us to decolonize wealth, we have to begin with decolonizing our mind.
Yes.
And that exists among people of color, as well as white folks. And so I definitely want to talk to you about just the steps that you suggest that white folks take. But before we get there, how do we as people of color, how do we begin the process of decolonizing our minds, right? And moving into a wealth mindset, right? I just think that it's challenging because a lot of people will say, well, I'll never be XYZ, or I'll never have whatever the case may be. If we don't believe it, if we don't see it, then how will we accomplish it? So can you talk a little bit about that?
You know, I think we all have to begin with being super connected to our own culture. Most of us come from cultures of abundance. We come from cultures that were communal and had a different way of viewing leadership and operating and being and just taking care of one another. And so as much as we can tap into where we are from and those types of values in our families that are in our bodies, right? We have to tap into that to remember, because again, we move and operate in a white dominant cultural world where we often put those things aside to come into organizations to do work in a different way. But those values and that culture is the very thing that's going to save us. It's the very thing that's going to sustain us and push us through to be resilient in these types of workplaces. If we give in and put those things aside to completely assimilate to the dominant way of thinking, putting processes before people, putting our own self-promotion before people, thinking in a scarcity mindset that I need to get this, over this other organization. Those types of dynamics are exactly what the oppressor that's how they want us to believe and behave and act. So we got to tap into what is actually already there for a lot of us and hold strong to that, because culture is those values are the spiritual aspects of many of our cultures are really what's going to lead us and guide us to on this path. And then I think that we have to find ways to begin having conversations among ourselves as people of color about internalized oppression. And so for me, for example, in my career, some of the most painful moments for me have actually been inflicted on me from other people of color. And, and as a young person looking up to other people of color, those were just horrific incidents that really made me question a lot of things. And so I've heard that story over and over again from colleagues of color. So how do we think of ways to support one another in decolonizing and addressing the trauma that exists in our communities, so that we're not taking on the behavior of the oppressor. We're not harming one another. We're lifting each other up and coming into our organizations and our work with mindsets of abundance. So that's work that we have to figure out how to do as a community and how to hold each other accountable. So when we see someone behaving in a certain way, how do we rally around those folks in love, but also create accountability? Because often we turn a blind eye and we allow these things to happen in communities of color because we don't want to bring someone down, or we don't want to call it out. We've all worked so hard to get here, and so I think it's hard for us to criticize and critique one another, especially in front of white people. And not saying that we need to do that, but we have to find ways to hold each other accountable to the values that we share as a community.
Don't you think that we can critique each other without bringing each other down? And if so, what would that look like as an example for people that are thinking about it? Because I think some of this is subconscious.
Yeah.
And so I think unless we really become aware, it's going to be hard for us to make that shift.
I do believe we can critique each other without bringing each other down. A big part of my book is actually a critique of philanthropy, but I also say in the intro that this is my family. I love philanthropy. I still work in the field. And because I love this field and because I love this sector, I have to speak the truth in love. So I think if we get to a place where we have genuine love for one another, we're going to get to a place where we feel that we can speak the truth in love. And it's all in packaging, right? I have been critiqued and held accountable by other people of color that I know love me and are looking out for my interests. And I take that feedback and that as a form of love and as a gift, because I know they're looking out for me. They're trying to hold me accountable, which I occasionally need that. Other times, I think we question or judge the feedback that we might be receiving from someone because, our discernment of their spirit feels off, right? So it is about if it's. I feel like any message can be that is completely like wrapped in love, can be well received by folks.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really want to get into the strategies,
Okay.
but then you keep saying things that make me think of other things. So, so I want to just tease out a little bit before we get into the strategies, this concept of money as medicine. Can you talk a little bit about that? Does having a lot of money make you a bad person? A lot of people may think that money can only be used to oppress people. I mean, people have all these ideas and concepts around money, but to hear that money could be medicine, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So medicine in the indigenous culture is basically anything that we determine to be sacred. So anything can be medicine. A rock can be medicine. This conversation right now is medicine for me. Anything that makes you feel good, whole, kind of restores balance in your life. Sometimes it's maybe having a call with a friend that cracks you up, like you're having a bad day and you're kind of off and you want someone to cheer you up. And so anything that we allow to be sacred for us can be medicine. And so the premise of calling money medicine, two-part. One, the accumulation of wealth and the way money has been used historically has inflicted harm and pain. And that wasn't the money's fault because it's neutral, but it is how the money was deployed. And so if money has been deployed wrongfully in the past, I'm saying that we can flip that and use money in a different way. So if money has been used to separate, divide, manipulate, oppress, conquer, could we use money as something that is helping to restore balance, to reconnect us, to facilitate relationships, to really achieve equity? And my premise is yes. And the way that we do that is by moving money to where the hurt is the worst. Where is the hurt the worst? In communities of color. And so when folks with resources, foundations, donors, are investing in a significant way, in a real way, in communities of color, I'm basically saying that they are using their money as medicine and they are participating in helping to decolonize wealth.
Right, and so when we bring that money into the community where people hurt the most, oftentimes what we see is that folks come from the outside, right? Because there is a discounting of the fact that the people there can solve their own challenges. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, we call that the white savior complex. Yeah, so there is a delicacy to this, right? So just because you might have resources and power and a platform, whether it's your family's money or you work in an institution that has those privileges, we have to really assess how we show up in communities and how we build relationship with communities. Even those of us who are people of color can behave as white saviors when we show up in a community thinking we already have the answer. We're not respectful to local and indigenous wisdom and knowledge. Understanding that those who are closest to the problem, right, probably have the best solutions for that. So I do believe there's a way that people with resources, organizations with power, can build relationships with community in a way that is authentic, that is about reciprocity and not sort of a transactional charity model. And that there's many examples in philanthropy where that's happening. And it's really about the approach of being aware of those of us who have resources or work in foundations have to be aware of that power dynamic and just in the way that we approach relationships that is respectful to the community.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. And then when we're looking at internalized oppression, then when the money comes into the community, we also have to be careful that we don't set up competition or are there any suggestions that you have for people that are saying, okay, well, I want to bring the money into the community, and I want to listen to the community, but then there are dynamics of internalized depression in that community, and so how do these folks help, right, bring the money into the community, but then facilitate this process of healing so that we're not fighting over dollars or pitting folks against each other?
Right. You know, I think that nonprofit partners, community groups, working in communities of color, led by people of color, there's work that we need to do around our history and orientation to wealth and money. Because we haven't had any for so long, right? We often do behave in ways that are dangerous to our own communities, to ourselves. You know, the mindset of scarcity that we talked about shows up in really real ways. And so what can we do to sort of get in front of that? It's really hard because, you know, it's complicated because we desperately need resources, but all of us have to take a step back and really center what is really important. The health and vitality of our communities, our young people, need to be centered in every decision that we make. We are not doing this to maintain jobs in the nonprofit sector. We're not doing this to, you know, to collect awards or prestige. If we're really centering what is best for our young people, then all of us are going to be willing to make compromises. And, you know, sometimes, you know, we may not be the one that's out front leading. It's a different organization. I think it's going to reorient how we build partnerships in the community. There's a lot of, you know, unfortunately painful, even when I ran a nonprofit, I ran a Native nonprofit, and I struggled, honestly, at times to build relationships with other Native organizations because of these dynamics. But again, we are feeding right into the dynamics of colonization by behaving that way. So I think we have to do our own work around healing, around changing our mindset to one of abundance. And, you know, again, there's great examples of where that's happening, where organizations have, you know, one quick one is an organization received a grant that I heard about. I talked about it in the book. And they actually said, you know what, we want this other group to get the grant. Like, we're good. We have what we need right now. They're also doing great work. How many times does that happen, right? But that's a place where you see these types of values of that we have often in communities of color really coming to play in a way that is really the way that we need to exist and be in community with one another.
Yeah, a lot of healing needs to occur. We have a lot of work to do, and I really do believe that we'll get there. I'm excited. Yeah. I'm excited that you've put a blueprint together. So you talk a bit about strategies. You know, if I were a white organization and I want to do better, right? How do I start that process? And so you came up with a series of steps. Can you talk us through those steps and just give us a little bit about you know, how a person can begin the process of decolonizing maybe their organization, their mind? Yeah.
So for my white brothers and sisters, definitely the work begins at home, right? And I think it can happen in conjunction. I've had conversations with organizations that are mostly white-led, who are also kind of doing their personal work at the same time. But I think that it's really about holding up a mirror and taking a long look in the mirror and examining ourselves in ways that may be uncomfortable. One is, you know, really coming to terms with history. We all need a history lesson in this country. We need to really understand what has transpired in a way that has not been whitewashed. That's a start there. Whatever issue you are working on as a nonprofit or a funder, whether it's affordable housing, healthcare, education, you need to understand the historical context through a racial lens that has led to the disparities that you're now trying to work on, right? There's a reason that you know, we have disparities in education in this country by race. There's a reason that health disparities are worse for people of color. There's a reason that affordable housing is more challenging for people of color. There have been intentional systems and policies put in place throughout our country's history that have favored white people.
I'm sorry, that just sounds crazy. Are you saying that this was intentional?
Yes.
It was intentional. So we have to come to a place of acceptance that that is the case, because a lot of white folks are like, look, that slavery thing, you know, and the boarding school thing with the Native Americans, even if they know what that was about, that was so long ago. Why can't y'all just get together?
Well, I mean, the fact is, it wasn't that long ago. I mean, there are policies that created the middle class, you know, in this country. That's with the white middle class. Communities of color didn't benefit from these policies like the GI Bill, right? And so you have to examine your own family. I like to take people through an exercise where we talk about different legislation and how it favored their family or how their family did not benefit. And people begin to be like, oh, I see that, yes, my grandparents were able to go to college because of this. And I was like, well, my grandparents were not allowed to go to college, you know? And so do you see, even as recent as, you know, a generation or two ago, we had systems in this country that favored white folks and disadvantaged others. And so understanding what you're trying to solve, if you're trying to improve education, if you're trying to improve healthcare, whatever your nonprofit cares about, if you are approaching that with a race neutral lens, then you're not going to be effective. You have to understand the policies and systems and how race was a part of that that led to these disparities. And so our strategies, whether it's funding or whether it's programmatic strategies from a nonprofit, have to be rooted and grounded in race.
Yes, absolutely. And one of your first strategies is around the grieving process. So can you talk just a little bit about why grieving is important?
Sure. I mean, grieving is the start, because if you do the work that we just talked about in terms of examining your own family's history with money, if you do the work and understanding what has happened in this country over the past 500 years, it's a sad story. It is a reality, a truth that is nasty and very painful. And if you actually do the work to fully understand that, you are going to feel a sense of grief. Whether you have been victimized by this story or whether you come from a family that were the colonizers and the slave owners and whatnot. So all of us have a certain type of pain or trauma that's connected to this country's history that we need to come to terms with. If you're in philanthropy, we need to grieve how this money was made, on whose backs it was made. We need to grieve the fact that it's shielded from taxation and held in public coffers. We need to feel bad about the fact that most of it's invested in Wall Street and in extractive industries. If we don't feel bad, this is going back to the moral and value connection of this. If we don't feel bad about some of these things, we're not going to be motivated to actually make a change in how we, the systems and policies and work that we do in the future. So grieving is the first step, not rushing to a solution, but actually sitting in the discomfort of the truth until it works its way through your body.
You are my brother from another mother, because that is the healing process. There's no quick fix. Everyone wants to take a pill and make it go away, and then they find out that I'm a holistic doctor. They're like, well, can I take an herb and make it go away? Like, no, it doesn't work that way, right? So, so after the person has grieved, then what are the other steps that you have to kind of go through in your mind and consciousness and in your actions and work?
Sure. So after grieving, and now the 7 steps in the book are not linear. I have to say every time it is a circular process. You may enter the process at different places and times, but after grieving, the next step in the process is apologizing. After you come to terms with the truth, the next process of any reconciliation is actually apologizing. And apologizing is more often, I think, about the offender, right? It's sort of setting yourself free in a sense by beginning to fully acknowledge what happened and your role in that, right? And so it's not necessarily about the person you're apologizing to, although I think for many folks that's therapeutic, right? But it's apologizing with no expectation that anyone is going to even accept your apology. But it's about ownership. And so this has happened at scale in countries like Canada, where there's been, there was a decade of truth and reconciliation and apologies on behalf of the government for what has happened to First Nations people. And so this just begins to open up the path for step 3, which is about listening. This is when you're moving from internal reflection and feelings of sadness and grieving to reflecting out on, well, how has this really impacted other people? Because if you haven't been through it, you cannot fully know, right? I tell funders who are interested in Native communities, you will never fully become an expert in Native communities. Like I can write all the reports you want me to write, I can send you, but you will never fully understand the experience, and that's fine. But you can get to a place of beginning to really listen and sit in community to the experiences of others. And I call it listening in color, right? Because it is listening not from a white dominant mindset where you may show up thinking you know the answers, showing up with your mind already set, and not truly listening, but listening with an openness to receive, to really sit in the other person's position and be willing to change your mind if you learn different types of information. And that is the really gets you on a path to be able to build an authentic relationship with someone who may have actually caused you harm.
Okay, so then now there's an apology, a grieving, a listening. Those are my favorite. I could just full stop right there. But if you could just briefly share what the other steps are, because I have one other question that I want to ask you about that.
Sure. So the rest of the steps are relate, represent, this is like a quiz, let's see if I can remember it all. Relate, represent, invest, repair.
Right.
And so those steps are really beginning to be action oriented, right? So once you build that relationship, you are then in a position to think about, well, how do I use, if you're a funder, how do I use my resources now in a way that acknowledges and remembers, right? So you're not going to say, I'm sorry one time and forget, right? We're going to remember this history. We're going to remember the responsibility that we have to these communities. And then that should start showing up in how we do business. It should start being reflected in our policies and our practices and in our grant making. So the fact that only 7 to 8% of grant making dollars are going to communities of color, and that has decreased in the past couple of years, everybody should be up at night wringing their hands about how to fix that, right? The fact that funders are not doing that is because they are not sorry. They are not grieving. They do not feel any sense of responsibility. And so this is why this process is important, because if you go through it and you are really beginning to connect and engage and listen and understand what's happening on the ground in communities of color, not just the need, but the wisdom and the resilience of what we have to offer. Yeah. The smartest and most experienced funders are going to go straight to communities of color and say, show us your model, teach us what we should be doing. And so those final steps are really ideas to reimagine, what if funders go to this process, what could be different? How can we invest in a more radical way that is going to decolonize wealth or shift or close the race wealth gap?
Yes, that is so important. Well, I could talk to you all day long, and I sure want to, but I can't close a conversation without asking you a little bit about Indigenous wisdom. So there is an Indigenous concept of 7 generations, and I want to ask you to explain that. But before I do, I want to say that it sounds as if you are teaching us. This is like an instruction manual for being human. Mm-hmm. This is an instruction manual for being human. Somehow we have, over time, given away pieces and pieces of our humanity. And how do we now then reclaim that and not see it as you win and I lose, but we all together can grow and heal and transform into something greater, right? So what is this concept of 7 generations?
So that concept is basically being very forward thinking about the implications of our decisions and our actions on the future. And so we believe that every decision that we make right now, every choice that we make is going to impact young people 7 generations from now. And so, you know, what we're experiencing now is a result of what happened 7 generations ago, right? And so this, you know, wealth is inherited and passed down. So is trauma. Trauma is inherited and passed down. I'm dealing with the trauma of things that my grandparents and their grandparents went through.
Right.
But we also know that healing can be inherited and passed down. So those of us that are being really intentional about reclaiming our humanity and beginning these healing processes, we hope that we're going to make things easier on the future generations. I don't want to pass down trauma that's been handed down to me. I want to see young people in the future. I want them to be able to look back and be like, wow, I had an ancestor who stopped this, who helped to, you know, derail these cycles of trauma in our communities. And that is what it's about. It is about reclaiming our humanity. Philanthropy means the love of humankind. And so this is, you know, another reason I wrote this book. Where is the love? Like, how can we have philanthropy in our mission or on our walls, or be a nonprofit that's a part of this charitable sector, but not have, you know, center love in our work? And so again, love, it's love, whether it's the love of money that causes us to do evil, or is it really about love of people that's going to cause us to break through some of the status quo to do the right thing for our communities? And so that's, I love that idea that it is about seeing ourselves as humans, but also others, and not just as humans, but humans that are really interdependent and connected.
Wow, wow, wow. Well, I'm so excited. Thank you for taking the time to share. I feel very honored to have this conversation with you. I've wanted to have a conversation across cultures because we have shared stories, right? And so this is a beautiful, beautiful manual. So Decolonizing Wealth, everyone, Indigenous Wisdom to Heal Divides and Restore Balance. You can get it at stores all across the nation. So pick up your copy. And I have to say, the most excited thing that I've seen is this, the bookmarks. I want to go everywhere with the decolonizer signs, right? So, so thank you again for being with us. You have tuned in to the Campaign for Black Male Achievement. We are so excited about this conversation, and you can listen to it again, or if you just picked up a piece of it, on our website at www.blackmaleachievement.org. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
So that was fabulous.
That was great.